Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here. Thank you. Before I get going, I just want to say thank you to Tamer for setting this up and all the volunteers. Let's give them a round of applause for all of the work that they're doing. So I've been asked to say a few words about the value of public discussion, public dialogue, and it's kind of a tough assignment, particularly for those of us who come from a culture that embraces public dialogue. It's sort of like saying, well, let's have a conversation about the value of air, right? How about that air? Isn't that air great, you know? But I think it is important to have this discussion and to maybe say some of the things that we don't talk about the values that public dialogue can bring to a society. So I'll start by just saying that, there is a benefit. Societies benefit from a free and open discussion, dialogue. And when I say dialogue, I mean several things. One would be any type of a venue like this where we're obviously bringing people on stage and discussing things and talking openly. But dialogues can also happen through the mass media, through television, through radio, through newspapers, where ideas are expressed publicly and exchanges are made. Maybe not immediately, but one idea and then another idea are exchanged. And then increasingly, I think we're seeing public dialogue emerge in with the internet, and obviously with the advent of social media. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, we're seeing this. We're seeing incredible dialogues flourishing, and I'll speak a little bit about that later. So there is a benefit to public dialogue. The way it's supposed to work, I think, the ideal way it's supposed to work is we say something publicly, we listen to what is said, and the listening is important. Being willing to believe that maybe we don't understand an issue as well as we could, and we're willing to listen to a different perspective, and then think about it, and maybe modify our views, and then respond with, well, here's how I see this, having listened to what you've said. And you know, obviously this doesn't happen all the time, and it's an ideal, but that's what we're shooting for with public dialogue. And I think anytime there's great social change that occurs in any community, it often begins with people that prompt public dialogue. People like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States, who talked about the plight of how blacks were treated in the United States, treated terribly, obviously. Or people like Mahatma Gandhi, who talked about the plight of Indians under British oppression. These people, we obviously venerate them for sparking the public dialogue about these issues. So they performed an important role. But it wasn't just that they made the change, it was that they provided the catalyst for people to have public dialogues. And those dialogues took place in the legislatures, in public events like this, in places of worship. And it was the dialogue that led to the social change. In fact, there's a German philosopher. It's probably dangerous to mention German philosophers early on a Saturday morning, but I'm going to do it. Friedrich Hegel, who said, you know, this is how the course of history goes. We have a thesis over here, and we have an antithesis over here, and these two are opposing forces. But then there's discussion, and eventually it leads to a synthesis of ideas, and we come to a consensus. And we can look at the course of history, and I think it's true. If you look, you'll see that there is this process, and this process involves public dialogue as we move toward consensus. And then, of course, the synthesis becomes the new thesis. So, you know what? I'm going to diverge just for a moment because I want to talk a little bit, because I've mentioned Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and these people who we venerate in society. We venerate these great people that were willing to say things that maybe were not popular with the entire society. These people have integrity. And we don't talk a lot about integrity much publicly. So since I have the venue, I thought I would take advantage and talk a little bit about integrity. There's a great book by a Yale law professor. His name is Stephen Carter. And he said, 3 things are required for integrity. By the way, integrity is not a cultural phenomenon. It's not centered to one culture. I teach here in the UAE, and I ask my Emirati students what the Arabic word for integrity is. And they all very quickly, does anybody know what's the Arabic word? Nazaha, exactly, very good. Nazaha. It means just doing the right thing, no matter the consequences. He said 3 things are required for nazaha, for integrity. He said we need to discern right from wrong. And this is where a lot of times we stumble, perhaps, because we're just moving so quickly, especially in today's world, it seems. We move, and we don't stop and actually take the time to reflect on our actions. So we have to discern right from wrong. And then once we've done that, we have to, number 2, he said, was we have to actually take action. It's not enough to know right from wrong, we have to take action and do something about it. And then the third part, which I think is fitting for this event and this idea of public dialogue, is that we must do so publicly. That we need to be willing to say, this is what I think, and this is why I'm acting this way, and do that publicly and be willing to state it out in the open. Just doing it quietly is not enough. Obviously, over the last year or so in this part of the world, there's been a lot of upheaval and whatnot, and we could probably pick a few people that have demonstrated nazaha in this region. I'm going to pick one because I think that her efforts should be lauded. There's a woman in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, there is women are not allowed to drive. I'm sure we're all aware of this, and you're probably aware of the woman as well. But she decided that driving was a right that women should have, and it's not right for women not to be able to drive in Saudi Arabia. And so Manal al-Sharif, that's her name, she said, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to make a statement and say that this isn't right. And so she got in her car and she drove around, and maybe some of you have seen the YouTube video of her driving around, driving, and saying, here, I'm doing it. And so there she discerned right from wrong, she took action, and then she did so publicly. She posted it on YouTube. And of course, she was arrested and went to jail for 8 days for her action. And so she obviously suffered the consequences of her action. So I think Manal al-Sharif offers a great example of nazaha, of integrity, and her willingness to take a stand. And she should be applauded. Another benefit of public dialogue is that it can heal societal wounds. Sierra Leone, West African country, had a terrible civil war for 11 years. It ended in the early 2000s. And incredible atrocities happened there. Children were killed in front of their parents. Women were systematically raped. Terrible strife for a decade, more than a decade. At the end of the Civil War, the United Nations stepped in, and they suggested a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this has been done in other places as well, South Africa and other places. And as part of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the victims of these crimes, they set up public venues for them to simply address the public and talk about what happened to them. Not for any purpose of retribution or punishment, but just to state publicly these terrible things. So these unspeakable acts, and think about that word, unspeakable, right? Things we don't even want to speak of. They were proclaimed publicly in these venues, and these events were also broadcast on the radio as well. And it proved to be a very cathartic experience for the people of Sierra Leone. And today, the country, you don't hear much about it, and that's because it's a relatively well-functioning country. It's a democracy, and it's actually praised for its cultural tolerance and religious tolerance. So there's this innate benefit to public dialogue, public speaking. All right, at risk of mentioning 2 German academics in the same talk, I'm going to tell you that there's another German that I'm a big fan of. His name is Jürgen Habermas, and he studied the public sphere. He studied this idea of dialogue, and he said there are actually 4 things that are required to create an ideal speech condition, to create a place where people can speak as freely as possible and engage in these dialogues. And he said that, number one, everyone should be able to engage in public dialogue if they want to. If you don't have the opportunity to engage in it, then it's not an ideal speech condition. Number two, he said people must be able to challenge the validity of other people's statements. So we needed to be able to say, okay, I heard what you said, and I'm not sure I agree with it. Let me tell you what I think, and that needs to be listened to as well. He also said that speakers must be truthful. And we don't talk about this a lot either in society, but there really needs to be an emphasis on truth-telling. When we say things, we need to mean them, and we need to be able to believe that other people mean what they say. And there needs to, if there's any inner motivations for what's being said, that needs to be put on the table as well, according to Habermas. And then finally, he said no speaker should be coerced, whether externally or internally, to not be able to realize these other three conditions. So he said this is the ideal speech condition, the ideal criteria for speech. After he got done outlining this, he then said, it's pretty hard to actually live in a world where ideal speech conditions really do exist. And he pointed to the mass media and the commercialization of culture and said these are some impediments to this ideal speech condition. But you know, that said, it's good to have this ideal speech condition laid out by Habermas. It's good to say, okay, well, here's what we're aiming for. Because if we don't know what we're aiming for, it's hard to get anywhere. So I think it's good to have these criteria laid out for us. Now, obviously, you know, in this part of the world, there's been some unrest. We're all familiar with it. And I think it's important to look at the role that the lack, perhaps, of a public dialogue played in some of these countries. I think that that a lot of people in, say, Tunisia or Egypt or Syria or Libya, they might say, you know, because we couldn't speak freely, we couldn't address some of these concerns that we wanted to address. And maybe the concerns were things like the relationship of the government to the governed, or maybe the concerns were the role of women in society, or maybe the concerns were just the crippling economy, the lack of jobs. You know, these are things that people wanted to be able to speak freely about, but for whatever reason couldn't. Excuse me. So there are some impediments, particularly in the Middle East, to speaking freely, to engaging in these dialogues, and we should talk about them. The governments sometimes take actions that don't allow for these ideal speech conditions to exist, whether it's through the arrest of somebody for their speech or some type of censorship or encouraging self-censorship. These are all actions that the governments sometimes take. Also, you know, another important impediment is a lack of civility at times. Last year, a great Emirati, Sultan Al-Qasimi, who is very active on Twitter, he wrote a fantastic column where he talked about what he called McCarthyism in the Gulf. He said that people were engaging in dialogues, many of them in these new social media ways, and when somebody disagreed with them, instead of engaging in a dialogue, they would just accuse them of being a traitor or accuse them of you know, not loving their country or something to that effect. And just as Eugene McCarthy in the 1950s in America, if somebody disagreed with him, he would say, well, you must be a communist. And that creates an incredible impediment to public dialogue, to being able to speak freely. So all of that said, I think what's interesting about living in this time and in this part of the world is the incredible changes that are occurring, including the changes in the public dialogue. There are obviously the technological advances. I just mentioned Sultan Al-Qasimi. The guy's got, what, 140,000 followers on Twitter. You know, he is able to engage in a public dialogue in ways that you could never have dreamed of, even, what, 2-3 years ago, really. It's incredible, the changes that are occurring. And the flourishing debate that is occurring on Twitter, on Facebook, is good for the society, and is providing a useful education. And I think it's important to realize that these discussions that are happening, and I know maybe some of you aren't aware of all the discussions that are happening on Twitter, but it's pretty incredible. There are some very frank discussions going on in this country and in this region about a lot of important issues, like the ones that I mentioned recently. But it's good. It's important to remember that it's a process. It's a process, and it's a thesis and an antithesis, and we're heading toward a synthesis. And the conversations that are occurring are part of that, and are good and valuable for the public. And of course, this event is part of that process. And this, we should be thankful that Tamer had this idea and put this event together to give us this opportunity to engage in dialogue. We're going to hear some speakers today that are going to present us with new perspectives that are going to make us think about things a little bit differently, and we should listen and consider them and think about them, and then engage in dialogue as well, as we all engage in this dialogue and this creation of this new synthesis. So thank you.